弟兄姊妹平安。
Brother and sister, peace be, to all of you.
嗱，今日下晝咧，我哋會喺2點鐘我哋會有一個嘅小組嘅分享。
So this afternoon at 2 o'clock, we're going to have a sharing group.
因為我哋有 group work 嘅。
Yes, there's group work too.
咁咧主要咧，我哋分享係乜嘢咧？我哋會分享咧就係關於今日摩西生平呢一個嘅題目。
And certainly, what we'll be sharing this afternoon would be the topic, the life of Moses.
所以今日喺講道裏邊咧，我會擺低一啲嘅問題，等弟兄姊妹去思想。希望你喺食晏嘅時候用一啲嘅時間去思想，跟住我哋翻嚟嘅時候，我哋用1個鐘頭一啲嘅分享，有一啲嘅禱告。
So therefore, during the sermon, I will be dropping some questions for you to think about, maybe over lunchtime, so that when you come back at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, we have about an hour of sharing and discussion.
咁咧如果可以嘅話，我都鼓勵你因為係小組啦，大家有 interaction 就最好。你能夠咧就如果可以嘅話，開你嘅熒光幕，但係又冇因為咁唔嚟啦。
So certainly, I would encourage you to keep your camera on. It's a small group, but certainly, hopefully it would be a close, kind of intimate group where we can share. But, if you don't want to turn on the camera, and maybe for that reason, if you don't want to come, that I want to encourage you to, not be kind of too concerned about that.
弟兄姊妹嘅時候，今日我哋會睇神點樣呼召摩西，我哋特別集中喺出埃及記嘅第3章，由第1到15節。
What we'll be focusing on this morning, would be from the book of Exodus, chapter 3, verses 1 to 5, and how God called onto Moses. 1 to 15, how God called onto Moses.
弟兄姊妹，頭先嘅主席喺祈禱裏邊提到咧，疫情咧已經過咗差唔多1年多啦。
So just now, the chair, as you recall, that the pandemic, has been raging on for almost a year.
弟兄姊妹，喺呢一個疫情嘅當中，唔知對你嘅人生產生咗乜嘢嘅影響？
So I want to ask you, so for the pandemic, how much, its impact, has been upon you during the pandemic.
可能你話我又要戴口罩，又要排隊，又要好多唔可以飲茶，咁所以咧啲好唔方便啊。
Perhaps you might be complaining about some inconveniences, you have to wait in line, to do grocery shopping, you can go for dim sum, or you have to wear masks now.
弟兄姊妹，呢啲可能係對你嘅生活產生咗一種嘅影響嘅。
Brother and sister, perhaps these, might have affect, the way you live your life.
但弟兄姊妹，我哋呢個疫情對你嘅人生、你嘅價值產生咩嘅影響？
But what about how does the pandemic affect your life, affect your values?
如果你話疫情冇事嘅時候出去飲茶去食飯大消費呢個唔係對你嘅人生產生嘅影響。
Certainly, if you were to just complain about, I can't go out to eat, I can't go for dim sum, perhaps, those things are just affecting, your lifestyle.
或者可能會喺呢個疫情裏邊，我哋體會到人原來好脆弱嘅。
And maybe, you realize that, these things that we are quite vulnerable.
無論你乜嘢背景，你都會面對有疫情嘅侵襲嘅機會。
Regardless, of what background, you're in, that, one way or the other, you have been intruded, your lifestyle has been intruded by pandemic.
可能俾你體會到，我係咪我要去追求我哋名利財富，咁樣就係我哋嘅人生。
Or perhaps you might say, well, am I going after prestige or wealth, that represent my life now?
或者可能你會體會到好多人喺困苦嘅當中，當疫情過後，我可以更多嘅去祝福周圍嘅人。
Perhaps you might realize that a lot of people, have suffered during the pandemic, and maybe once the pandemic is over, you might be thinking of offering like some help and support to these disadvantaged groups.
弟兄姊妹，我哋可以話我哋有一年喺屋企啦。
Brother and sister, you might say that, you've been home, housebound for almost a year.
姊妹，我哋有冇好好善用呢一年，以至帶俾你人生嘅裏邊做一次嘅重整，以至我哋更加合實嘅心意。
If you ask of yourself that, have you make use of the time being home now, to kind of review and revive your life such that we've become like children of God, that are ever like pleasing Him?
當時摩西嘅時代，摩西一出世嘅開始，佢會面對一個民族嘅滅絕嘅厄運。
Certainly, when Moses was born, he was in a crisis of a genocide.
但係佢被保留喺一個嘅籃嘅裏邊嘅時候，又飄到喺埃及嘅女嘅公主嘅面前嘅時候，又蒙恩寵以至咧佢能夠保存生命。
But yet his life, Moses' life was preserved, even though in a time of crisis, he was placed in a wheat baskets, and then somehow, it flowed and flowed like, into the river and reaching the palace, and the princess, of the Pharaoh raised him and nurtured him like, to adulthood.
佢唔單止能夠保存嘅生命，更加能夠喺由佢嘅成長嘅過程，由佢自己嘅親生嘅媽媽去提攜，以至佢能夠保留咗猶太人嗰個文化嘅傳統。
So not only that his life was preserved, he was indeed nursed by his like biological mother, and such that he could preserve some of the Jewish traditions, and norms.
喺嗰個嘅情況嘅裏邊嘅時候，又保存生命，又能夠喺個皇宮嘅長大，可能摩西個人嗰個命運係十分好。
So certainly, you might say how Moses, his life was preserved, and he was able to grow up in a palace, and you might say that he has a good fate, a good life.
但係因為佢見到一啲嘅埃及人去蝦猶太人嘅時候，所以佢去為猶太人出頭，而結局係遭法老嘅追殺。
But yet he was angered by, how the Israelites were being treated by the Egyptians, so therefore he revolted, and eventually, he had to flee, for his life.
40年喺皇宮裏邊嘅成長。
So he was brought up in the palace for 40 years.
40年去到曠野嘅當中，只有牧養葉忒羅嘅羊群。
So another 40 years he spent in the desert raising, his, at the time, like father-in-laws, like, herds.
弟兄姊妹，如果你係摩西，你會點睇你嘅命運？
So, brother and sister, if you were Moses, how would you how would you see your life?
可能你會有一個感覺，英雄無用武之地。
Perhaps, you might have a resolution that, even though I'm such a hero, but, there's no way that I could extend my influence.
明唔明？我同啲我點樣嗰個喺皇宮裏邊點樣嘅生活嗰種嘅派頭，或者我點樣學問對住啲羊，只係乜嘢咧？咩？
So even though I was raised, in the palace with good tradition, such good intellect, and enjoy the wealth like being in a palace, but right now, in the desert, and shepherding, these animals, what good did what I had help me?
可能你會同我或者可能摩西當時都有個咁樣嘅諗法，我嘅人生就係對住班羊。
Perhaps Moses would have this kind of like thinking that, well, maybe perhaps my life, would just be shepherding animals.
就喺 摩西80歲嘅時候，神呼召摩西。
But yet, at the age of 80, God called upon him.
喺摩西牧養葉忒羅嘅羊群嘅當中呼召摩西。
So while Moses was shepherding, the herd, for Midian, then, God called upon him.
神能夠呼召摩西，神亦都同樣喺呢個時代，可能透過呢個環境去呼召緊你。
So not only God could call like Moses then, but certainly, under the current circumstances, God could have been calling upon you as well.
喺我哋成長喺我哋嘅人生裏邊，竟然有一段嘅時間叫做 pandemic。
So as we are growing up, that somehow in our life that, there was this like pandemic.
真係8年一次啊！
Certainly, it happens maybe once in a century.
係呢件事都唔知有個 term 叫做 pandemic。
So, perhaps before this, you might not even know the term like pandemic.
當我哋面對 pandemic， 係咪正係埋怨，讓我哋生活咁痛苦？定係我哋留意到，原來喺呢個時候，神去預備你同我，去回應緊神對你我嘅呼召。
As we come upon the pandemic, perhaps you might say, it's so inconvenient. This is ridiculous. Or on the other hand, you would look to the pandemic as a way of God's way of preparing us, for even bigger things.
今日就讓我哋睇出埃及記第3章由第1到第15節，我哋去嘗試睇神喺呼召摩西嘅當中有乜嘢值得我哋去學習同埋反省。
Certainly, we're going to study, chapter 3, verses 1 to 15, how God called upon Moses. Perhaps, there are lessons, that we can learn from the scripture.
留意第1、第2節。
So let's pay attention to verses 1 and 2.
摩西牧養他岳父米甸祭司葉忒羅嘅羊群一日，領羊群往野外去。到了神嘅山，就是何烈山。耶和華嘅使者從荊棘裏火焰中向摩西顯現。摩西觀看，不料荊棘被火燒着，卻沒有燒毀。呢一個係神向摩西一個嘅呼召。
Certainly, this is how God called upon Moses.
喺呢一度嘅時候，唔係一個特別嘅節日。
Certainly, it wasn't a special festive day.
係一個好日常，當時摩西做咗40年要做嘅事情。
Certainly, it was just an ordinary day that Moses was doing, what he had been doing for the past 40 years.
每日就係一早帶啲羊就去山裏邊去飲啲羊去咩啦。
So each and every single day, he would lead the flock into the desert and let, the flock, kind of have their food.
日出完去又翻嚟，第二日又出去翻，人生40年就係要咁樣去過啊！呢個係叫 routine。
So that was as you see Moses' routine, in the morning he would lead the flock into the desert, so that they can graze the land, and then at the end of the day, he would lead them back. So that was in and out, in and out, in and out for 40 years.
又係一個咁平凡、咁 routine 嘅日子，神向佢顯現，以致呼召佢。
It was just an ordinary day, such a routine day, that God came upon Moses, and called upon him.
同樣可能今日喺你好 routine 嘅人生嘅裏邊去呼召你。
Perhaps God, might be, in your very ordinary days, during your routine, that God would come to you and call upon you.
留意咧喺呢一度嘅時候，摩西見到喺荊棘裏邊被有火燒，但係荊棘冇被毀，呢個叫做異象，甚至係一個大異象。
So apparently, you look at this, Moses came upon a huge kind of miracle because the flames of fire was lit up the bush, but the bush, did not burn up.
弟兄姊妹啊，我唔知當時如果俾你睇到同一嘅情景，
Brother and sister, if you were there, that's exactly, what you observe.
嗱，你會有咩反應？
What would your reactions be?
可能你第一個反應會攞盆水就唔熄佢先咯，係咪？
Or perhaps you might kind of fetch for water to try to stop the fire.
或者火燭啦，走啦。
Or, you might flee, like, run away as quickly as you can.
或者嗰個火種唔係我留咁就得啦，走啦。
Or perhaps you might say, well, I didn't like lit this fire, so maybe I'll just should walk away.
但係你會留意呢一個嘅情景，呢一個異象咧，摩西係睇得好清楚。
But certainly, to Moses, that vision was crystal clear. He could see
點
it.
解摩西會咁留意，而我哋可能會忽略咧？
So why would Moses be so discerning? Then perhaps maybe for us, we would just kind of like ignore it.
因為《使徒行傳》形容到摩西學咗埃及一切嘅學問，呢啲叫學者性格。
So apparently, in the book of Acts, it mentioned that Moses was educated in all the wisdom of the Egyptian and was powerful in speech and action.
啲學者成日問點解會發生？哇，咁樣嘅觀察力好強。
So being an intellectual, so he was trained that, he tended to pay attention to details, to
呢
things.
個係從一個好嘅角度睇，從唔好嘅角度睇，因為摩西嘅習慣咧，即係好多事㗎嘛，係咪？
So from a good angle that, he was being, discerning, observant. On the other hand, maybe, he was just being nosy.
有乜嘢人嚟打交，佢都要走埋去問一問，跟住順便打埋落去。
So like somehow you might say, some people or you're just being nosy, you want to know each and every single thing, even people fighting on the street, you might want to
無
know
論從
what
好
happened.
正面或者負面嘅角度嘅，呢個都係摩西嘅性格啊。
Certainly, whether it's positive or negative angle of looking at Moses, but we learned that, that's like, Moses' character.
無論可能你都唔知你嘅性格係乜嘢，但係神知道我哋嘅性格。其實神用一個最好嘅方法去抓摩西嘅 attention， 以致佢能夠接收一個嘅睇見異象 vision。
So, whether your character or we look at Moses' character, but God reached out to him through, his character traits, how God, how Moses, would kind of become sensitive to, his surroundings.
弟兄姊妹，如果今日神可能已經用咗適合你嘅性格嘅方法向你發出呼召，你有冇忽略？定你捕捉到神對你嘅心意咧？
So, brother and sister, if God were, to use ways to try to alert you to his calling for you, have you been aware of what God might be kind of calling you?
神可能透過好多你嘅經歷，好多你嘅遭遇，或者好多嘅你嘅睇見，而心裏邊有一種嘅迴響，對你發出嘅呼召，你收到。
So God might be kind of like alerting you to like some of your experiences, some of the things you encounter, as ways to alert you in terms of like sending, he's calling onto you. Are you aware of these?
第一方面嘅時候，我哋會睇神嘅呼召，可能係一個好普通嘅日子，喺日常嘅俾你一啲嘅睇見，按着你嘅性格，你係可以收到嘅。但係神要問你收到嗎？
Perhaps like God might be sending you, calling you on an ordinary day and using ways that ordinarily, you would have kind of like noticed or become aware. The question like to you right now is, do you know?
摩
Are
西俾
you in pursuit?
摩西俾我哋一個好好嘅榜樣，喺第4節話，耶和華神見他過去要看，就從荊棘裏呼叫說：摩西，摩西。他說：我在這裏。
So Moses sets, such a good example in verse 4. When the Lord saw that he had gone over to look, God called to him from within the bush, Moses, Moses. And Moses said,
弟兄姊妹，每一次神向人發出嘅呼召，期望人有一個回應：我在這裏。
So God called upon us, each and every one of us. God expected us, to be exactly like Moses' response that, Lord, here I am.
你記唔記得喺以賽亞書第6章裏邊嘅時候，神向以賽亞呼召，以賽亞同樣嘅回應：我在這裏，請差遣我。
So if you recall in the book of Isaiah, chapter 6, God called upon Isaiah the prophet, the same way when God called out Isaiah, like said, here I am, Lord, so send me.
親愛嘅朋友，如果神俾你一啲嘅睇見，向你嘅內心發問某某某某，你會點樣回應？
So dear friends, let's say God were to kind of call onto you like so and so, so and so, like today, how would your response be?
神嘅呼召你知道嗎？
So God's calling onto you, are you aware? Do you know?
你留意第7節開始嘅時候咧，神向摩西有一個咁樣嘅表白。
Certainly in verse 7, the same paragraph that, God had such an expression here.
請容許我用表白。
So, it's almost like, God's revealing himself.
表白係點咩意思咧？你向你所愛嘅人表白，你希望對方收到。
So certainly when you reveal something to your loved ones, you wish your loved one, would have received it.
嗱，所以喺第7節嘅時候，你留意咧，神好期望摩西收到一啲嘢嘅。
So certainly in verse 7, as you see, God truly wanted Moses to have received, his like revelation, his disclosure.
第7節裏邊嘅時候，耶和華說：我嘅百姓在埃及所受嘅困苦，我實在看見。
So the Lord said to Moses, I have indeed seen the misery of my people in Egypt.
神睇見。
So God sees it.
他們因受督工嘅轄制所發嘅哀聲，我也聽見。
The Lord continued to say, I have heard them crying out because of their slave drivers.
我原知道他們嘅痛苦。
The Lord said, I'm concerned about their suffering.
神冇淨係喺一開始嘅時候就話：摩西，摩西，你做乜？你做乜？
So God never started out like, and basically barking out orders, commands.
神喺當中將佢嘅心向摩西表白。
Certainly the Lord first and foremost reveal, how his heart felt at the beginning with Moses.
嗰啲人嘅困苦，去睇見，去聽見，去知道。
So the Lord said, I've seen their suffering, I've heard them crying out, and I am concerned. I know of their suffering.
點解神要向摩西咁講？
So why did the Lord reveal this, to Moses?
神亦都希望摩西感受到佢所感受。
Apparently, God really wanted Moses, to experience the same thing that God had experienced himself.
關心到佢所關心，
Caring for, what he wanted to care for.
呢個就係叫異象。
Certainly, this, is the vision.
異象唔係淨係接到 order， 而係帶咗一種嘅負擔去承接神嘅負擔，繼續去前進。
Certainly, a vision is not just like fulfilling an order, but, to be burdened, by the calling, and such that taking actions, to meet the vision's need.
神可能要同你同我去或者唱首歌啦。Do you see what I see？
So maybe, God like wanted us, please see, what I see.
神要我哋帶着負擔，領受神嗰種嘅負擔，去承接嗰種嘅異象。
And God wanted us, to discern, the burden, that comes with the vision, such that when we stepped up, to meet, the vision.
唔係淨係做啲嘢，而係帶着負擔去為神做一啲嘅工作。
And not only, to just to get the work done, but to be burdened, and carry this burden along in meeting, the vision.
咁我哋希望幫助到人去到一個咩境地咧？
So, how would that help, like, us, with this?
係咪淨係幫佢冇得食有得食咁就算咧？
So does it mean that, for someone who is hungry, that, we just feed them? Is that it?
請留意神嘅表白嘅裏邊，喺第8節咁樣話：我下來是要救他們脱離埃及人嘅手。
So apparently in verse 8, the Lord said, I have come down to rescue them from the hand of the Egyptians.
係拯救佢哋。
So to rescue them.
唔單止拯救，亦都領他們出了那地，到了美好嘅寬闊流奶與蜜之地。
Not only rescue, but to bring them up out of that land into a good and spacious land.
唔單止拯救，佢亦都可以引領佢哋。
And not only to rescue them, but to lead them out.
離開嗰種嘅捆綁，進入神自己為佢預備嘅祝福嘅美地。
To flee, from the binding that they were in and into a land flowing with milk and honey.
但呢個係咪嗰個終極咧？
So was that it? Was the ultimate outcome?
如果你繼續去留意嘅第12節嘅時候，神說：我必與你同在，你將百姓從埃及領出來之後，你們在這山上侍奉我。
Apparently, not just getting into the promised land, but verse 12, the Lord said, when you have brought the people out of Egypt, you will worship God on this mountain.
你要留意咧，中文聖經用侍奉，英文聖 NIV 係用 worship。其實咧，侍奉同 worship 咧，其實同一個字根。原來神期望我哋唔單止去拯救嗰啲嘅人，引領佢哋去到一個咩境地啊？去到去敬拜，去侍奉神。
So apparently, as you see, God's, heartfelt desire was to not just rescue the people, but to lead them out of suffering and into the promised land, and such that, they could worship and serve him. And here worship and service, they have the same root here.
嗱，弟兄姊妹，咁呢個就係神自己嘅心意。
So this truly, is God's wish, his desire.
Yes, God will. OK， 亦都係神希望摩西收到，亦都希望你同我去明白呢個係佢嘅意旨，佢嘅心。
So certainly, God truly wanted Moses then and us now that, to understand, God's very own will.
神嘅心意你明白嗎？
So do you understand and discern God's will?
摩西、保羅，如果你問保羅，保羅好明白。
If you were to ask the Apostle Paul, he then, he can say, he truly understands.
所以佢咁樣回應帖撒羅尼迦教會，佢話：因為他們自己已經報明，我們是怎樣進到你們那裏，你們是怎樣離棄偶像，去歸向神要服侍那又真又活嘅神。
So when Paul, spoke with the Christians at Thessalonian church, for they themselves report what kind of reception you gave us, they tell how you turned to God from idols to serve the living and true God.
神嘅心意唔單止去幫助一啲嘅人，而係引領一啲嘅人去到去敬拜、去侍奉佢。
So God's will, not only, he wanted to rescue people, but he truly wanted his people to worship and to serve him.
神要使用你，
Sorry, yeah.
神要使用你，
So God will, make good use of you.
神要使用你喺呢個時代，成為佢嘅手，將拯救、將引領、將幫助帶到你周圍嘅人去敬拜、去侍奉神。
So God will use you, at this very time, in history, to rescue, his people, to lead them such that, they could come to a place, to worship and to serve God.
神喺 pandemic 嘅當中保留你同我嘅生命，神對你同我有咩心意？
So during the pandemic, God has, kind of kept you and me alive, what would God's will be, for you and me?
同神只係期望你同我 pandemic 過後出去飲餐茶，就係咁簡單。
Perhaps like that's God expects us, so that our lives are being kept, that maybe after the pandemic, we could get out, and have dim sum and enjoy ourselves.
不但我哋內心常常去問，我可以做啲乜嘢去引領我周圍嘅人去敬拜、去侍奉神？
Perhaps, one question that, we might contemplate would be, how could I kind of rescue and lead people into the Lord so that, they could worship and serve Him?
神嘅心意，你明白嗎？
Do you understand God's will for you?
當我哋睇最後一個嘅段落，
So as we come to, the last part of the scripture,
我哋一齊讀第5節好嘛？
so let's read verse 5.
神說：不
Do
要
not
近
come
前
any
來，
closer,
當
God
把你
said.
腳
Take
上
off
嘅
your
鞋脱
sandals,
下，
for the place
因
where
為
you
你所
are
站之地是
standing,
聖地。
it's holy ground.
神向摩西顯現，
So God revealed himself to Moses.
第一樣佢要摩西要認識嘅，你所站呢一個地方係一個聖地啊！
The Lord wanted Moses to know that whatever, he was standing, he was standing on holy ground.
呢個地方係一個聖地，係因為呢一笪地方係喺何烈山定係其他因素？
So the place was a holy place. Was it because, it was on the Mount of Horeb, or, there would be other reason?
呢個地方都我相信唔係摩西第一日去㗎啦，40年邊度冇去過咧。
And certainly, the place where Moses was standing, apparently, he's been roaming around that place for 40 years. Perhaps it was just there.
點解今日呢一個地方變咗叫聖地咧？
So why would the place all of a sudden, like that he was standing, became a holy land, holy ground?
今日呢一笪地方，神喺其中。
So it is entirely because God was there on that particular day. He was
神
present.
要摩西好留意呢一笪聖地，神嘅性情、神嘅屬性之一，佢係一位聖潔嘅主宰。
So God truly wanted Moses to know that whatever he was standing, it was holy ground. The Lord wanted Moses to truly understand the nature, of God.
摩西認識到神嘅聖潔嘅時候，佢蒙上面，因為怕看神。
So once Moses realized, the true nature of God, then, Moses hid his face because he was afraid to look at God.
當然當時摩西會有一啲驚，但係摩西亦都學習去做一樣嘢，就係因為神係聖潔，以致我需要咩？去敬畏佢。
So what Moses learned, was that, because God, is holy, therefore, he had to learn to kind of have reference, like to fear of
神
God.
呼召摩西，唔單止俾佢工作，神亦都要摩西去認識到佢係一位點樣嘅神。第一樣，佢係聖潔嘅神。
So certainly, not only God called upon Moses to serve him, but at the same time, he wanted Moses to truly understand his nature. And the first thing, he taught Moses was, he would have to hold fear for him.
希伯來書嘅作者講到，其實神係烈火，所以我哋要記得了不能震動嘅國，就當存感恩，照神所喜悅嘅，用敬虔、虔誠、敬畏嘅心去侍奉神。
So in the book of Hebrews, the author said, God is a consuming fire. Therefore, since we are receiving a kingdom that cannot be shaken, let us be thankful and so worship God acceptably with reverence and awe.
神係聖潔，神希問不得，所以我哋要帶住一種敬虔嘅心去敬畏佢，去服侍佢。
So God is holy, and he cannot stand blasphemy. Therefore, when we come to him, we have to be holy as well, and be clean when we come to him.
否則我哋咪得到神嘅祝福，而係得到神自己嗰種嘅刑罰。
So instead of receiving, God's blessings, instead, we, could have been kind of punished.
喺呢 個段落嘅時候，神要摩西認識佢兩方面嘅事情。第一方面係聖潔，第二方面係乜嘢咧？
So God wanted Moses here to learn from two things. First, of course, he would have to be holy himself.
你留意第11節，
In verse 11,
當神呼召摩西嘅時候，摩西有一個咁樣嘅回應。摩西對神說：我是什麼人啊，竟能去見法老，將以色列人從埃及領出來呢？
when God came to Moses, Moses apparently, he said to God, "Who am I that I should go to the Pharaoh and bring the Israelites out of Egypt?"
Who am I？
我係什麼人？
我係什麼人？我可以見法老。
So who am I? Why did I have to go see Pharaoh?
我冇 Jackie Chan 咁好打。Who am I？
So, I wasn't Jackie Chan, I couldn't fight. Like, why would I go?
某個程度，摩西問呢個問題好好嘅。
So it was indeed quite right, for Moses to have asked the question.
當我哋去侍奉神，我哋都可能會好似摩西一樣嘅諗法。Who am I？ 我可以做。
So maybe when we serve the Lord, often we would have this same query about who am I? Why should I go to serve the Lord?
神要摩西認識嘅，佢可以去，係因為第12節神說：我必與你同在。你將百姓從埃及領出來之後，你們必在這山上侍奉我，這就是我打發你去嘅證據啊！
So in verse 12, like God said to Moses again, I will be with you, and this will be the sign to you that it is I who have sent you. When you have brought the people out of Egypt, you will worship God, on this mountain.
乜嘢叫咩證據啊？係叫神與我哋同在。
So, the evidence, would be God will be with you.
係嘛？哇！摩西去到紅海裏邊個紅海嘅水分開，係唔通摩西識武功啊？而係神同在啊嘛。
So, Moses led the Israelites to the Red Sea, and the sea parted, and it wasn't because of him, he had any special talents, but indeed, it was God, was with them.
冇嘢食啊！地下裏邊有嘢出嚟嘅時候，俾佢食啊，仲要問乜嘢嚟啊？馬拿啊！
So there was no food, once they got out, but indeed, there was food, like there was manna, like, for them to eat.
你試下出去啊，執下啲草食啊！你睇下你有咩事啊？如果唔係神同在。
So anyhow, if you were to go out and just fetch some grass, like to eat, if God were not be with you, what would that be like?
神要摩西明白 ，no 唔係 Who am I， 而係我與你同在。
So God wanted Moses to discern this fact. It wasn't who he was, but indeed, how God, would be with him.
你打勝仗唔係因為 Joshua 好打，而係我與你同在。
So you won the war, the battle, not because Joshua was there, but indeed it was God. I was with you there.
你俾人蝦，神同在，開咗個地吞晒你嘅敵人，神嘅同在。
So if you were bullied by your enemies, but God kind of opened up the land and swallow all your enemies,
神
it
同
wasn't because of
在
you,
係
but
一
because of
個，對唔住，神同在係一個證據。
but certainly God's presence, was truly the evidence here.
神要摩西唔好問 Who am I，instead 去認識 Who He is。
So God didn't want Moses to ask, who am I, but to truly understand, who, God truly is.
如果以色列人問啊，帶我嚟嗰個出嚟嗰個係邊個啊？邊位神啊？喺第14節話，神對摩西說：我是自有永有的。又說你要對以色列人這樣說：那自有的打發我到你們這裏。
So apparently, God wanted Moses to know, I am who I am. And this is, what you're going to tell like the Israelite, I am has sent me to you.
摩西問呢一個問題，因為喺當時埃及嘅有好多嘅神，每一個神都有佢嘅名。
So apparently Moses asked because at the time there were many gods, like, in Egypt. So he wanted to make sure that, he was crystal clear on this.
你要認識呢位嘅神，呢位嘅神係咩啊？自有永有 ，I am who I am。我唔係被嘅意思，我唔係被造，而係我係創造宇宙萬物者。
So in other words, Moses needed to make it clear, and this is not just any God, but God said to him, I am who I am, like from the beginning, I am here.
就係呢位 I am 去 send 摩西去出去幫助以色列人。
So this is the God I am who sent Moses in the first place to rescue the Israelites.
唔單止係咁樣。
And not only that,
喺第15節話，耶和華是我嘅名嘅，直到永遠，這也是我的紀念，直到永遠。
God also said, to Moses, this is my name forever, the name by which I am to be remembered from generations to generation.
神呢位自有永有者係需要被紀念。
So this is the one God, I am who I am, that, he needs to be respected and remembered.
神差遣摩西，神要摩西好清楚，差佢嗰個係叫做自有永有、創造宇宙萬物嘅主宰。佢差遣佢，係佢要被紀念，唔係我。
So God sent to Moses a very clear message that the God who sent him, was the God, from the beginning, he was the eternal God, that, he needs to be remembered.
神喺呢一段經文向摩西表達佢兩個屬性。
So in this paragraph, as we see, God had revealed to Moses two of, his nature.
His two attributes.
Or two attributes.
姊妹，神要摩西開始侍奉嘅時候，認識到佢係一位聖潔嘅主宰。
So God truly wanted Moses, as he began to serve him, that, he was the beginning and the end,
佢係聖潔嘅主宰。
That, he is a holy God.
佢亦都係嗰位自有永有者。
He is, who he is. I am who I am, God.
弟兄姊妹，如果我問你，你識唔識神嘅屬性？你可能噏一大堆嘢俾我聽。
Brother and sister, if I were to ask you, perhaps, you might tell me a list of the attributes of God.
神要透過摩西對佢嘅屬性嘅認識，而摩西嘅生命得以陶造。
So apparently God wanted Moses to be fully aware of God's attributes, such that, Moses' life, could be shaped and formed.
神亦都期望去透過呼召你，唔係淨係叫你做嘢，而係喺你侍奉嘅過程，你認識神嘅屬性，而係陶造你同我嘅生命。
So God doesn't just want you to kind of get His work done. Basically, through his calling to you and through your understanding of his attribute, such that your life can be shaped and formed.
弟兄姊妹，你對神嘅屬性嘅認識對你有咩影響？
Brother and sister, when you're aware of God's attributes, now, and how does that affect your life, your service?
我哋知道神係聖潔，有冇帶動你去更加敬畏神？
So knowing that God is holy, does it help you to hold fear for God?
弟兄姊妹，喺過去你嘅人生裏邊，神點樣透過你對佢嘅認識去塑造緊你，以致你成為更合佢使用嘅器皿。
So how have God shaped you, for you to understand his attributes? How have that changed you and influenced you as to, how you relate to him and served him?
姊妹，你有嗎？準備下晝同我哋分享。
So brother and sister, have you? And I wish that you could think about this, and share with us in the afternoon.
弟兄姊妹， 神嘅屬性你了解嘛？
So, brother and sister, God's attributes, do you recognize? Do you
了解你應該
understand?
似佢，了解你應該有改變。
So, if you understand, if you know, then perhaps, you might have, or you should have changed.
我約伯記裏邊有咁樣嘅記載，你要認識神就得平安，福氣也必臨到你。
Like the book of Job, submit to God and be at peace with him. In this way, prosperity will come to you.
你認識神，生命改變，呢一個福氣就出嚟啦。
And you've known God and your life, have transformed, and such blessing already, will flow through.
新正頭啊，你要唔要福氣啊？
So, we're still like technically, in the new year. So do you want blessing?
Technically 係 New Year，咁啊，你要唔要福氣啊？唔係新年我哋都要啦，係咪？
So even though, it's not like during the new year, but you wish, you want more blessings to you.
認識神，透過認識神，你生命改變，你福氣就嚟。
So by coming to know God, to recognize him, and that's, where, your blessings, the source of your blessings.
出埃及記第3章，神呼召摩西，亦都今日同樣呼召你。
In Exodus chapter 3, we read that, God called upon Moses then, and now, God also calls upon you today.
神喺出埃及記第3章表達神嘅呼召，你知道嘛？
So in Exodus 3, God's calling to you, are you aware?
神嘅心意，你明白嘛？
And God's will, like, do you understand? Do you discern?
神嘅屬性你了解嘛？
So God's attributes, do you understand?
我哋3個都 say yes，咁你就去承接神喺呢個時代，喺呢個 pandemic 嘅時代對你嘅呼召啦。
So if you're fully aware of these 3 aspects, that perhaps during the pandemic that you can truly hear, how's God calling you out to serve him.
求主幫助你，亦都求主幫助我。
May the Lord help you, as well as me.
喺呢個時代裏邊，能夠回應主喺你身上嘅召命，作主喜悅嘅事情。
So during these generations that, we could truly respond to God's calling, unto us, and to fulfill, his will.
我哋唱一首詩歌作為回應。
So we're going to sing a response song now.
願喺呢個黑暗冇盼望嘅時代，神使用你同我將真光普照。
In this time of darkness, God used you and me to kind of bring light into the world.